Hello, everyone. Happy Monday. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I am Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Analysis. It was a very busy weekend in geopolitics. We had a lot of things happening. First of all, the United States extended its March 1st deadline to increase tariffs on U.S. imports of Chinese goods. That keeps actually with our 2019 annual forecast. A lot of drama in Venezuela, where you had Venezuelan opposition groups in Colombia and in Brazil trying to deliver humanitarian aid into Venezuela, and the Venezuelan military literally blocking it. You had Kazakhstan completely replace its government. You've got Saudi Arabia appointing a new deputy defense minister, which means a whole host of things for internal Saudi affairs. There's also got Kim Jong-un is on his way, of course, through China to get to Vietnam to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. But that's not what we're going to talk about here today. If you want to hear more about what's going on this week in geopolitics, this year in geopolitics, this century in geopolitics, geopoliticalfutures.com is where you can find us. You can get a paid subscription to all of our analysis so that you're the smartest person in the room at all times and you know what's going on. In the meantime, though, we're bringing to you part 2 of a conversation between our CEO, George Friedman, and Leighton Smith, a longtime host in New Zealand of News Talk ZB, and now has his own show, the Leighton Smith Podcast. Again, you can go check out his podcast online, and I'd encourage you, if you're enjoying these podcasts or if you found GPF through these podcasts or any other ways, we'd love to welcome you to the website. We've got a lot of free material that you can get. You can sign up for a trial. You can try it for a month. There's a lot of different options for you to get smarter about geopolitics in the world. So hope you enjoy this conversation between George and Leighton. Please remember to review the podcast, leave us little comments on iTunes. We read them and cherish them more than we should. And we'll see you out there. Take care.
Now, on the Leighton Smith podcast, last week we spoke to George Friedman. We talked largely about China, its future role in this country's future, Australia, the balance of everything, and it was fascinating. On this particular occasion, we want to extend the conversation to Europe and Great Britain and Europe, if you want to distinguish, and to North America, and to Venezuela and Russia, if we can fit all that in the time that's available. George, appreciate your time again. Let's start with. It's difficult. Let's start with the United States. Very recently, of course, very recently, we've seen all sorts of activity, and I'm talking political activity based in Washington. We've seen all sorts of nonsense going on about socialism. So let me start with a question. How smart was Trump in his State of the Union speech to take the approach that he did when he mentioned socialism? How smart was he? And in your opinion, is there ever in the foreseeable future the possibility that America will lean much, much more towards socialism than it does now?
Well, it's very hard to imagine, but I mean, the thing to understand is much of the United States is tuned out to Washington. And it's tuned out to Washington because, unlike other countries, it really doesn't matter what Washington does or says. It's in gridlock. It's not going to get anything done, and we have lives to lead. So in Texas, where I live, we occasionally, look at Washington, but mostly we're bored to death of it. You're not getting anything done. The president is the president and behaves as he does. His opponents are his opponents. They behave as they do. And it ceased to be a spectacle. It's become tedium. And this is what's important, different in the United States and European countries, where a crisis in Paris or a crisis in Vienna would paralyze the country. The United States is constructed differently. It's not a European country at all. And a crisis in Washington does not necessarily affect anything. So all the posturing that we see going on in Washington, breathlessly reported in the major media, my sense is that, well, we have our own positions, whether we support Trump or not, but it's not strongly held. It's not passionate like it once was. The hatred of Trump is passionate, but only by some people. For most of us, life is going on quite well, and we don't care. And this is really important to understand because the journalists from foreign countries go to Washington, get caught up in the heat, get caught up in the excitement, don't leave Washington very often, and don't get the sense that in the United States, it's really boring.
Who really then is controlling central politics, federal politics? Who, and you and I have discussed this before, and I expect you'll probably say much the same as you have in the past, with referring to the separation of powers. But who is pulling the strings?
No one. It's in paralysis. The Senate is in the hands of the Republicans, very firmly. The House is in the hands of the Democrats. The presidency is in the hands of the White House, and nothing can get done. And therefore, the country goes on without it. So the question that I would ask is not who's controlling Washington, but what is controlling the rest of the country. And that's what America is all about, business. Business is going on. Unemployment is at the lowest level in years. The economy is growing, so far at least. Everybody is taking credit for it in Washington. And so the United States is a very different place. We're in Texas. Washington is far away and doesn't matter nearly as much to us as what the Texas Department of Transportation plans to do with Interstate 35, which you've never heard of, which I care about. But I can assure you in Texas, this matters a lot more.
As a matter of fact, I have. I think I've even been on I-35. But
you have indeed.
Yeah. The part, though, that I don't grasp is that there are, let me use this as an example. There are a lot of people who are moving to Texas. And I understand there are people moving out of Texas as well. But overall, it's a net gain year on year. And the population is increasing. And there are seats in the in Texas seats, I mean, state seats that are swinging and going to the Democrats. The Democrats seem to be at this point of time lurching to the left. The midterm elections last year patently had a very strong influence on the Democrats and where they're headed. How it turns out in the long run, I don't know. But with millennials, with an increasing number of foreigners, illegals and legals arriving in the United States, then is it not becoming more, in my terminology, dangerous that America is leaning leftward? And that by the way, will affect you in Texas. You've got Bozo. What's his name? I can't remember his name. Who was very close to winning in that midterm election, and the people who were voting for him seem to be growing in number. Give me a response.
The House of Representatives is 435 people. The Democrats have about a 30% edge, 30-seat edge, I should say. The Senate is not in their hands. The president is not in their hands, and the many exotic people have emerged. Actually, very few exotic people have emerged, but they're the ones that the media is paying the greatest attention to. What you have, however, is elections coming, and you don't see that sort of leftism in Texas or in Minnesota or in many places. You have some people coming in that position. You've not seen a sea change in American political life. The polls don't show it. There's a long, long way to go before any change should be made. It has to have both houses under Democratic control, the presidency under Democratic control, and you also have to have the Supreme Court accept that what they're wanting to do is constitutional, which in many cases, such as the wealth tax, isn't. So the United States government is built not to function well. The founders distrusted government. They created a system of government that usually, except in extreme emergency, is incapable of doing anything well. And for that reason, because of the nature of the regime we have, the rest of the country is not terrified of what Washington is going to do, because Washington is normally in a position that it can't do much. And this really has to be understood. which is, yes, there are interesting people the Democrats have brought up, and God knows the Republicans have produced a few, and now we're in a situation where the bizarre meets the bizarre, but on the whole, no one here is in panic that we are going to have a socialist revolution or a fascist one or anything like that. It is amazing the extent to which Americans don't care what's happening in Washington.
Does that not create the opportunity for those who are seeking to change things to do it, shall we say, quietly and succeed?
Well, you can't do it quietly. You have to get elected, and you have to get votes in the House of Representatives and votes in the Senate and the presidency, and you can't do it quietly. The system is designed that quiet political activity is not possible. And, the regulatory process may be quiet, but you can't really get anything done quietly. Again, we're not like New Zealand. We don't have a parliamentary form of government. Even if, we had the president and the same party of the House, the Houses and the Senate are quite capable of voting against him very happily. You don't have that centralization. And so if you live in a country with a parliamentary system, you look at Washington, you might say to yourself, my God, what is going on? And what is going on is the fact that founders didn't want a parliamentary system because it made things too powerful. And you hear speeches, and from those speeches you draw the conclusion that something is happening. But it was just a speech, and it went away. And there are all sorts of people, one from the Bronx, that's from the district not far from where I was raised. And she's a lot of fun to watch if you're bored and have nothing else to do. And now that the Super Bowl is over, well, you'll pay more attention maybe.
Down the track a little, another time, I want to have a serious conversation with you on this podcast with regard to the Constitution and where it's at the moment and where it might go. Now, let's transfer. Oh no, we can't leave America without discussing a country to the south because it's current and it's an issue. Now, I'm going to quote you again. When America went into the Middle East and started some activity, it was suggested by all and sundry that America was simply after oil. That was the only reason to be there. I proposed that to you. Your answer, your response was rubbish. If we'd wanted oil, we would have invaded Venezuela. Now there is talk of exactly that. What say you?
Well, the one thing you don't want if you're invading a country is to talk about it. It's got to be a surprise party. Look, Venezuela had a socialist government that was less socialist than corrupt. The idea here is this is an example of socialism, perhaps. But it was a very corrupt country. Chavez became complicit with drug dealers in Colombia. Money was transferred to Cuba. The regime was supported by Cuban intelligence services. It was a mess. And it continued to be a mess. And we have reached a point where it is utterly insustainable in the sense that food has become impossible to get. It's in a terrible situation. Now, because of the glut of oil in the world, Venezuela's oil doesn't matter. Everybody's kind of sick of it, but nobody wants to do anything about it because they don't want to go to the trouble. But in the end, it falls to the United States to take a position, and we have decided to do something bizarre, announce another man as president who isn't, but we're not sending in the Marines. But what we have learned is going into other countries to set it right is a very dangerous business, and we're not about to do that until or unless something happens, certainly unless the rest of Latin America does. But what's interesting is the rest of Latin America has gotten sick of Maduro and the regime because they're having an immigrant crisis. The people leaving Venezuela, and they're going to Peru, they're going to Ecuador, they're going to Colombia, and nobody wants them. And so they are beginning to press on it. And the only thing that's really supporting the regime are the Cuban intelligence people, security people, that are protecting Maduro. So we will watch this play out, and the United States is likely to come in only in the most extreme circumstances and when supported by what's called the Organization of American States.
Very good. Let's use Venezuela as a transition to, well, this aspect of it as a transition to the other side of the world. Is there any Russian activity in Venezuela?
I'm sure there's Russian activity. It's not getting anywhere. They apparently flew a plane in to take out all of Venezuela's gold, which I thought was a pretty savvy move on their part if they could get hold of it. But, putting a base into Venezuela is like putting a base on top of a melting iceberg. It's not a very good idea. So the Russians like to do things that appear to be purposeful and effective because they can't do anything that really is effective. So they make it appear that way. So yeah, they showed up in there and, we didn't care. Basically, Venezuela is a place from the American point of view that we have consistently stayed away from ever since the socialist government was elected, and we're continuing to stay away from. And, with occasional threats of invasion that no one quite takes seriously, that's about where we're going to stand.
All right. Now, last week you touched on Russia in one brief moment. I want to then move to Europe and the United Kingdom, and however this plays out, I'm talking about Brexit, of course. My gut feel always has been, and I picked them to vote to leave, but my gut feel has always been that they would be better off outside of Europe, because Europe is, well, quite frankly, to me, it's an abomination. Would they be better off outside from your perspective?
Well, it's how they went outside. And since Europe has now shown itself as doing everything it can to make it impossible for the British to carry out their treaty-related rights to withdraw, this is drawing attention by everyone to what Europe is. Look, we've seen extraordinary things in Europe. We see a near break in relations between Italy and France. We see the British Isles in chaos. We see Eastern Europe pulling back away from it. This edifice is coming apart. And one of the most important things to watch is Germany. Germany exports 50% of its GDP. That means half of its economy depends on other people buying its goods. And we're heading into a kind of worldwide slowdown, even recession, which happens periodically. And Germany, who, for example, has as its number one customer in the world, the United States, sells to the United States Mercedes. That's the big sell. And what is it that we don't buy in a recession? Mercedes. So imagine a Europe this badly fragmented, in which the center of Europe is in deep economic trouble. And then we try to imagine how Europe, this experiment of Maastricht, survives. I don't think it can. So I think the question of whether there's Brexit is secondary right now to the question of what happens to Germany and what happens to the EU if Germany can't function.
And the answer is?
The answer is that Europe goes back to what it always was, the smallest continent of the world, with 52 sovereign states, with bad memories of each other, never forgetting, never forgiving, and not really liking each other. The fantasy that somehow Europe could be abolished and we could invent a European man who doesn't speak any language that anybody else understands, was a fantasy. The free trade zone was an excellent idea, but it's like NAFTA. We have a free trade zone. We argue with each other, but the Mexicans don't tell us how our courts should function. We do not tell the Canadians what kind of schools they have to have. We're sovereign countries. We're completely separate. We have the usual threats against each other, but we trade intensely with each other, and that's what it was all about. This was an attempt to create something that doesn't exist, a European man. And in attempting to create that, they have been pounding on everybody. And they leave Britain particularly. It doesn't matter if they leave or not. The country is so divided over this question that I don't know how it comes back together. But you're also seeing the thought of Scotland becoming independent. You see the Irish question suddenly floating up again. What has happened with Europe is that all of the subjects that were settled, Catalonia being part of Spain, all of these come back up. So this is like a bad dream. And that's what's come of Maastricht. The free trade zone, the European community, was an outstanding idea, functioned extremely well. But Maastricht took them to a different place where people like Jean-Claude Juncker actually has authority over nothing. It doesn't even have a structure of authority.
And that's a very good place for him, having authority over nothing. Look, just finally, something completely different from out of left field. I want to quote you something from an Australian newspaper. Google's plans, Google's plans to create an audio news service similar to existing radio networks should alarm not just media companies, but society as a whole. Over the past 2 decades, Google has caused severe destruction and disruption to the journalism business model. Not a lot has been written about Google's plans to change the way we listen to news, but I believe, says the author, it is time for media publishers to start taking notice and to take a stand. Audio news is one of the new growth areas for media. Smartphones and smart speakers are encouraging consumers to seek out information in different ways, and millions now listen to news and podcasts digitally in their homes, cars, or on public transport. It goes on, it's very hard-hitting. It concludes this way. There is certainly no doubt wherever you live, the US, Europe, Asia, or Australia, and I'll add New Zealand, we are all at the same critical point. We've reached that moment in time when we need a new digital operating landscape, one that's equitable to all. Let's not let Google do with audio what it has already done to print. Now, my purpose in raising this with you is quite simply that there is a centralization, a narrowing of control of information and information flow in the Western world in particular. What role does it have, do you think?
Well, I would look at it this way. There is nothing more reactionary than the press. When Murdoch was buying up newspapers, this was the end of the world. What the press really wants is to be able to do journalism the way it was done 50 years ago. And it can't be. And no other industry wants this. And the fact is that if he feels that there should be a new model, why doesn't the Sydney Morning Herald develop it? What are they waiting for? So what they want is to be able to continue to print a paper newspaper, have it delivered to your doorstep a day late, have you read the news, and keep faster modes of news there. If he wants a new model of media, if he wants a new model of digital media, well, then build it. Go out, get investment, imagine it. So this is, I remember these complaints in the United States when we have 3 networks and they dominate news, and they're all leftist and what have you, NBC, CBS, and ABC. I heard these about it, BBC. It is an amazing thing about a newspaper who publishes an article that something must be done about Google, but doesn't recognize that it's the one that has to do something. It keeps waiting for someone else to save it. And the answer is evolve, invest, change, and invent. I'm not a fan of Google. I don't really like some of what they do. But I have contempt for media people who condemn the rise of alternatives, demand that new alternatives arise, but don't take responsibility for doing that. This is a major Australian newspaper. Show us what you can do.
Well, the paper wasn't the Herald. If I misled you there, then my apologies. No, it was the
No,
It was a Murdoch paper.
fault.
It was the Australian. And
Well, that's really I really enjoy watching Murdoch's papers whining about overwhelming media, because a generation ago they were the ones doing it.
If we had time, I'd take it a little further. In fact, let me steal another couple of minutes. The way that I see it is that what is it's not the competition that he's complaining about, but it's the domination of a global corporation that is sucking the lifeblood out of the out of independent media to the point where they've been folding. This is now an approach they're taking to what I've done for most of my life, and that is radio news and delivery, and the use of products like their speaker system that is voice controlled, etc., and says do this, do that, and the ability then to dominate the news and to therefore distort the news delivery, which is something that I feel rather precious about. As in competition, and competition providing alternatives, and alternatives providing eventually, one way or the other, as close to the truth as possible.
I understand, but I'm blaming the media for this. Google provided a service. People liked it and bought it. That's what's supposed to happen in capitalism. Newspapers didn't change. They expected that they were somehow sacred and not going there. It was the inaction of the traditional media to Google that gave it its advantage. It simply does better at what people want than the newspapers do, as they currently are. I look at Google for the news. I find it biased, no more biased than most of the Australian newspapers I read. But that's not the issue. The issue is that what the newspapers are asking is that something stop the public from using these things. Google is very smart and has flourished by providing services that people really want. So, it's particularly interesting with Murdoch, because when Murdoch took over the London Times, and he changed it very much from the newspaper it was to what it is today, everybody complained that he was destroying the media. Now, Murdoch's newspapers are complaining about it. My answer is that in due course, Google will overplay its hand in the sense of start investing in things that it can't recover from, like General Motors did and so on. But never forget that what made Google what it is was not a conspiracy, but the offering a set of products and services that people have bought and are still buying. They're living with it. And don't forget that for the conventional newspaper, people aren't buying you. And that's not because there's a conspiracy by Google. It's that you're not very good delivering timely news. Get better.
There you go. Well, podcasting is becoming very big, so I'm told. And it's been a pleasure having you on my podcast. I would say that most people, well, everybody not most people, everybody listening appreciates it. I've been copying it email-wise, text-wise. When's George Friedman coming on? Here you are, or here you have been, and you will be there on the Leighton Smith podcast for time immemorial. Thank you so much, and we'll do it again not too far down the track.
Thank you, Leighton. I enjoy practicing being the curmudgeon.
And it's advertisement free, except for let me say that Geopolitical Futures is what I consider to be as good as it gets when it comes to deep information. And if the Globe is your playground, then you want to have a look at subscribing to it. And it is not overpriced. Geopoliticalfutures.com.